So Yvonne asked me what scripture I wanted to work with this week a couple weeks ago, and for some reason this is the one that popped into my mind first. And it's pretty familiar, especially to those of us who have grown up or spent significant time in progressive Christian churches. But the last few weeks, since I chose this passage, things have happened in our collective life here in the United States. And so what I'm going to share on today is going to be a little bit different than what I'd planned. But it will still have everything to do with the scripture, and it'll still have everything to do with spiritual formation, which I think of as the work of building our capacity to connect deeply and then live actively from that connected space. So I'm going to share 3 types of practices today from trauma specialist Resma Menachem that I think are essential for spiritual formation work. But before we get to that, I want to contextualize within our current moment. So the last 3 weeks have in many ways brought to center the question that's offered in this scripture, that question of what does God require of you, or what does the divine require of us? And in the midst of the moment, what is the invitation for each of us as individuals and all of us as a collective in our movement toward healing and living with the full dignity of that which has been given to us? When the scripture asks and then answers that question the way it does, what does it mean for us really in this moment to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God, and in all the different ways that different translations say those 3 things? In the last 3 weeks, there's been an assassination attempt on a former president and current nominee. Another to-be nominee chose to be no more. One of our political parties had a mass celebration that, while it said they were going to tone it down and focus on unity, had signs with the phrases "mass deportations now." And it hosted what felt like, to me, were open mic nights with open white supremacists. That's one of our political parties. The other major political party spent those weeks not really knowing what to do with themselves and being very public about that questioning, while a fog of uncertainty and no small bit of despair, certainly for me, washed over those of us who are worried about democracy. And then a new to-be nominee was endorsed and rallied around, immediately to be met with an onslaught of racist and sexist attacks, likely forecasting what the next few months, and likely much longer, is going to look like here in the United States. So I want to invite you, did you feel any sense of constriction or intake of breath there, or in the past few weeks, have you felt an increase in your anxiety, your stress, your maybe irritability? Things have been happening is a massive understatement. And so on a personal level, just to put all my cards on the table, many of you know my personal life, in those same 3 weeks, I sank into one of those spaces of deep questioning where it's really hard to do much of anything at all. I was watching the news every day, I still am, watching the news every day, checking in between work meetings and starting a new school program, writing and sending out my weekly email, which feels like a Herculean task right now, herding my 2 little kids. I bought a new Roomba that scares both of our dogs. My partner started a new job, or is starting a new job. She has started her own new school program. So things in my life have just been hectic in like this very compressed time frame. And so when I come to the scripture this morning, in the midst of all of that, there is a deep exhaustion, there's grief, and there's a lot of fear. I'm terrified as fascism becomes more and more mainstream. A white Christian nationalist fascism predicated and rooted in racism and misogyny. I'm afraid for my kiddos growing up. I'm afraid of thinking, as I used to teach history, I'm afraid of what I have said again and again when I look at things throughout history, saying, if I had been there, I would have done something. Well, here I am, and am I doing something? And at the same time, alongside that fear, I feel this percolating invitation, and maybe you feel it too, toward real collective, everyday application, finding the things that are mine to do within the context of everyday life and the communities around me that have so much resilience and power and fear and anxiety and exhaustion as well. In the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, Resmond Menachem wrote that he would hear folks, especially white folks, describing any potential future widespread revolts as unimaginable. It can't happen here. This is America. This was just a blip on the radar, this January 6th stuff. And as long as we elect the right person, prosecute the folks who were involved, we're not going to have any more issues. And what he realized was that these voices, these people, these everyday folk who were noticing this and saying these things, what they actually were meaning was that my body has not been conditioned to handle the energy of this moment, of an attempted coup, of the potential for widespread mob violence. In other words, my brain can't imagine fascism here in the United States, normalized street violence, continued attacks on democracy, the shifting of our government as we know it. My brain can't imagine it because my body hasn't been tempered enough to handle the energy of it, even as an idea. And so when the idea does come up in conversation or on the news, when the idea does come up, we bypass it, push it away, deflect it as possible. And what that means is there's no need for us to prepare as if it might be. So I'll invite you again to check in with your body. Notice any shifts, as any of the words I just said, any tightening, constricting, the intake of breath, the desire to shake it off. My favorite church moves, this is too political for worship. Or what does this have to do with God and Jesus? Or maybe Andy's gotten a little lost in the sauce since we last saw him. Maybe. But one of my greatest fears is that here we are and none of us is ready. And this has everything to do with spiritual formation. My greatest fear, that here we are and none of us are ready. That too few of us have the embodied capacity built, the spiritual formation to hold the energy of this moment, to stay connected to a visceral experience of the divine, to our collective imagination and resilience, to not be shocked into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn in the face of that which we really don't want to see as possible. What are we prepared and preparing to do to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with a divine presence that doesn't shrink from the messiness of our lives and the life of this world, but enters into it alongside us with a depth of intention and soft eyes, yet eyes wide open, attention and focus. In a moment such as this, what does it mean for us to take seriously, and this is a serious question for each of us with our family members and our workspaces and what does it mean for us to take seriously this task and intentionally move through our own defensiveness, our discomforts, our extreme comforts, our that can't happen here's, our hesitations to engage the world honestly, and our desire to safely observe from the distance and the background? How do we name our discomfort, what is going on in our body, and hold that energy while choosing to take our next imperfect step nonetheless? How do we fiercely, if not fearlessly, opt for action in the face of the abhorrent, no matter how small or how big that might be for us? My belief is that spiritual formation means absolutely nothing if it doesn't bring us into our lives in this moment with movement. That spiritual formation is an active pursuit, an active process, an active and ongoing dedication we get to make over and over again that says, I am a commitment. Not I have a commitment, I am my embodied presence. I am a commitment to justice, to mercy, to humility. And so what does that mean for me in this moment, and in this moment, and in this moment, no matter how small, noticing that the moment-by-moment choices we make are our spiritual formation. It's not just done in a Bible study or a book group. It's the moment-by-moment choices. Those are when we are formed. And becoming more intentional with our choices will be the only way that we are resilient enough, skillful enough, prepared enough, practiced enough to meet the threat of fascism and Christian nationalism here in America and here in Redmond, which is going to take its own unique flavor and look. This is a task for all of us. And this is spiritual formation that's necessary now, real, embodied, and rooted. And so going back to Resma the trauma specialist, Redmond. He wrote this amazing book. It's called The Quaking of America, and I think it's one of the most foundationally important books to read right now. But he shares that we build our capacity to hold this energy and to keep moving by putting in the reps. That's his language for those day-to-day choices. Practical, real-time spiritual formation, putting in the reps. He says, as tension increases in our country, which, as we all know, really means in our family gatherings, those little comments that are made, or in our workplaces, in our churches, as the tension increases, the anxiety, the collective anxiety, putting in the reps is what builds our capacity to hold the energetic charge of this moment and to stay in it. We might say that these practices, or putting in the reps, build our capacity for honest and fierce acts of justice and mercy, practices that forge us and form us in the midst of the mess and the crisis, not off to the side, but in it, helping us to make the embodied shifts, the small ones and the big ones, that help us do what Adrienne Marie Brown says, feel the tingling, prickling aliveness of futures becoming possible. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a beauty out there. There's a beauty right here. So what does this mean? And this is where I'm going to get a little bit more practical. When I say reps or building capacity, what are we talking about here? What can spiritual formation look like right here, right now, in the midst of this moment? Resma says there's 3 kinds of reps, 3 kinds of practices. And these are the things that we can begin to do that will help us hold this energy and metabolize it within our bodies into real and active, engaged movement. The first are called living reps. These are the opportunities and challenges that pop up in our everyday life. And they're the ones we're most familiar with. Your coworker misgenders someone, and you have a choice. Do you lean in and say something, or do you ignore it ever happened? That's a chance to do a rep. Your friend comments that all parties are the same, and therefore voting doesn't matter. Right? That's a chance to do a rep. Are you going to say something there? Someone on the church council comments on crime going up and connects it to immigration. That's a choice. That's a chance. That's an opportunity to lean and do the rep. Do the rep of saying something, asking the question, engaging, or choosing to sweep it under the rug and just keep going. Resma writes that these life reps are usually unwanted, and they will almost always make us uncomfortable. We've all felt that when we're in a room and someone says something and the air is just sucked right out. Or you feel that rock in your gut of, is someone going to say something? Right? And then no one does. Because as a collection, we're really uncomfortable with doing the reps. So when we're faced with the potential of a life rep, which we all do every day, we build capacity by noticing our discomfort and staying in it to the point that we can safely, or we maintain the status quo by just moving right along. And for those who are like me, really struggle in those quick moments where the words just aren't quite there, one of the things I practice saying beforehand, especially if I'm going into my partner's family's house, which is very different in values than mine, I practice a question. And when I go in, I say, if I hear anything that might be something that I can ask a question to, I say, the question I offer is, what do you mean by that? That one phrase is an invitation. When someone says something, it shows the mirror back up to them and says, hey, you just said something. Can you actually face the words that just came out of your mouth? Can you explain that further? That's a great question to hold on to in those moments. That's a life rep, asking that question. And the second kind of rep is an invited rep. These are the reps we actively go and find. We invite them into our lives. Resma says they help us get used to pushing beyond our limitations and leaning into our discomfort rather than reflexively recoiling away. So this is a very real thing. Last week, Heather and I had an honest conversation. We're driving in the car. And I asked the question, what are we prepared to do when violence escalates in our area? What are we prepared to do? It was an invited rep for us. It was uncomfortable. It was uncertain. It was scary. We hadn't asked that question in such a when violence does, not if. And so we talked about our willingness to show up to protests with pepper spray milk. We talked about who we would leave the 2 kiddos with for safety. Like, what would be our action plan? We talked about getting gun safety training, which is like a massive discomfort for me. I am extremely uncomfortable with that. And we talked about the things we weren't willing to do. There were lots of them. And we talked about openly, like, why this was such an uncomfortable conversation. That was an invited rep, making that space and having that conversation, building our capacity to hold the energy of that conversation and stay in it. Invited reps might also include practicing the lines. Like I said, when you go into a situation you know is conflict-ridden, practicing those lines you're going to say. What do you mean by that? Or they might mean opting in to get involved with a local activist network, choosing to connect existing programs. I think about Open Kitchen and lots of other existing programs here in Redmond, connecting them with organizations that can do political education, voter registration support, citizenship exam support, activist training. It could look like joining the local mutual aid network here in Redmond. Or invited reps could be things that are much more familiar to us when we think of formation. Really intentional journaling, visualization, body scans, building our capacity to hold the tension and hold the energy of the moment in those small moments. And then Resma shares a third type of rep. And I want to invite you, as I share these, if you feel like a lot of defensiveness kick in, just notice that and try to stay open. These are foundational, and they're so connected to our Christian tradition and the expanding body of trauma work. So he calls these primal reps. They're the reps we engage with that help us become more aware of and process and metabolize the energy in our bodies. They're primal. They're core to us. Swaying, humming, singing, stretching, crying. Those of you who know have been in my workshops, I use the phrase a lot, seeing with soft eyes. And it's a primal rep practice of softening face muscles. So in the midst of crisis, these primal reps, done individually and collectively, help us move the weight of the world that we're carrying and metabolize it through our systems. This is why our bodies cry when we're overcome with anxiety. Get that energy out. This is why running is such a great stress reducer. This is why Christian and other religions and secular ceremonies and protest movements all involve singing, dancing, lament, swaying, humming, chanting, and so on. All 3 of these types of reps, living, invited, and primal, are formative for us. They're examples of spiritual formation, embodied spiritual formation. They help build our capacity to stay connected and connective in the midst of the great upset. And that's spiritual formation, practices that help us stay in tune and attuned in an embodied way to what it means to be deeply human, living within something so much bigger than just us. And so when Scripture today says, what does the divine require of you? And when our current reality brings us into moments of constant active choice, face-to-face with fascism and a white Christian nationalist movement that says some are good and some are bad, and some have choice and some have none, and some are human and some are less than, when we're faced with a real and embodied question of what does it mean to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God, it's going to take reps. We can't think our way there because it's going to be uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. When we saw those signs that said mass deportation, now it needs to be uncomfortable, and we cannot let that discomfort be displaced or bypassed. We have to hold the energy of it, name this is uncomfortable, this is messed up, whatever language you have for that. It needs to be held and faced and metabolized into action and movement. And so when I ask that question of what are we prepared and preparing to do, it's a question predicated on the capacity, on our capacity for being present to what is real, to what is happening outside of us and happening inside of us, to doing the reps, to processing the discomfort, and to keeping our gaze on the beauty of what is possible, to becoming embodied commitments to justice and healing and presence in our everyday lives, in our everyday conversations, in those little moments with family members or little moments with people who are brand new to your life, and the big moments of showing up in protest spaces when we might feel that discomfort and feel like we're out of place. Those moments where you see a protest emerging organically and you want to go. There's something inside you that's pulling you, but there's so much discomfort that keeps you right on that couch watching the news. This is spiritual formation for the moment we're in. And we cannot talk about spiritual formation disconnected from this moment. This is spiritual formation for the moment we're in. We've got to do reps, choosing actively to do the reps. And it's going to look different for each of us. And it's the task for all of us.